Now, when I'm referring to the 3D modeling tools in Photoshop, I'm actually referring to this subcategory of selections in the 3D menu, the new mesh from Grayscale selection. You can generate pre-canned shapes from layers, as we just saw, and I suppose if you were patient, you could combine these into some rudimentary 3D models. But if you want to actually do real 3D modeling where you can generate complex shapes, you need to focus on this selection of tools. Now, you may be familiar with this approach in other applications, but if you're not, the gist behind making a mesh from a grayscale is that the pixel values of a layer are turned into three-dimensional geometry based on their brightness. And in this case, our layer is empty, so if we attempt to apply any of these, we're going to get an error that tells us it couldn't complete the command because the area is empty. So you have to have pixels to work on in order for this to work. Let's start with just a filled layer of white pixels. Our background layer is white, so I'm going to hold down the Command key or Control on Windows and hit Delete, and that'll fill our screen with white. Let's come up to the 3D menu and just very quickly make a new plane from Grayscale. Now, your first comment might be, it looks more like it made a new grayscale from a plane because everything on screen went gray and it was white before. Well, in fact, it is still white. The default lighting in the screen results in this appearance of gray. But if we use our Object Rotate tool, or you could also use the widget if you like, we can click and drag on this plane that we just created and see that, in fact, it is really a three-dimensional plane. You might also ask yourself why this is any different from just coming up and using a new postcard from Layer. Well, one of the first differences we'll notice is over here in the Layers panel, where instead of just a diffuse layer, which is the color of the layer, and if we hover for a second, we'll see a little representation of what it looks like, just a pure white layer. But there's also this new layer, Planar Depth Map. And just like we can with any other 3D layer, and just like we can with a smart object, we can double-click on this layer to access it. I'm going to do that now. And we're in full screen mode here, so we want to see our elements 2 up. And we have a little bit of an issue here because when I pulled out our 3D palette a little bit earlier, I didn't dock it with the layer menu. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to click on the menu tab here, drag to the right until we see this blue line appear. Now when I let go, these are actually fused together into a single dock. And if I come back up once more and choose 2 up, you'll see that our layers are now comfortably next to each other. It's a little crowded on my screen. It almost certainly looks a little roomier on your screen. But I'm going to zoom out both of these. Even though they look pretty small, this will give you a better idea of what's going on. I'm going to hit the X key to swap my foreground and background colors. And now let's do something very obvious to our layer. And what I'm going to do is come up to the Filter menu, come down to Render, and choose Clouds. And when we do, the familiar fractal noise pattern will appear on our texture layer. Now, the results don't immediately get passed back from view to view until you come back and click on the chalice layer. You don't have to save this layer, as in typical smart objects, but as soon as we click back on our original chalice layer, the grayscale values that we've generated over here in our depth map are now converted to geometry in our original image. If we drag around, you can kind of see it. You'll notice that the brightest pixels in this image correspond to the highest peaks in this mesh, and that the valleys in between are represented by the darkest pixels in the mesh. So hopefully you can start to see that by carefully controlling the grayscale map, you can create some pretty complex 3D models in Photoshop. Now, you've been able to do this for years in most 3D applications, for years, but Photoshop allows you to bring all of Photoshop's tools to bear when working with these maps. So, for example, if we come back into our layer, we can convert this into a smart layer. Oops, which we don't do by clicking on the icon. We actually have to click on the text. That's a common mistake. I do it all the time. But if now we come up to the Filter menu and go to the blurs, we could choose a Gaussian blur. Crank this value up to something like, I don't know, 12. Click back, and you'll see that the level of detail in our map has now been greatly smoothed out due to the blur that we applied to the map. We can also adjust the extremeness of the altitude change here. by coming back in and going down to our adjustment layers and choosing levels. And a live level effect will allow us to crush the contrast down quite a bit. And when we do, once again, don't have to save, just come back over, click on Chalice, and we'll see that the waviness of our map has been greatly reduced due to the lower contrast in our source map. So you can kind of get an idea here of what we're talking about.